Welcome to Macrocode. If you're new to this channel, consider subscribing. So today we are going to learn about ASP.NET Core Identity. So ASP.NET Core Identity is an authentication and authorization API that is used to implement security-related features in our ASP.NET Core applications. So ASP.NET Core Identity is a built-in membership system or framework which allows us to implement and manage user accounts, authentication and authorization, email confirmation, password recovery, two-factor authentication, external login providers like Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and others. So, but before we actually dive into our today's video, we first need to understand what is authentication and why do we need it. So authentication is the process of checking the identity of the user that accesses our application, and most of the application has login feature, and application validate user identity against any trusted sources such as database or external login providers. So in simple terms, authentication is the process through which a user proves his identity by logging in into the system with an email and password. So using authentication, the system determines who is accessing its data. So in some scenarios, just to give a very quick scenario, in some companies, they usually provide employees with ID cards when actually joining. So an employee needs to present or scan their ID at the entrance so that they are able to be allowed into the workplace. So the ID actually, in this case, identifies the employee, without which the entry is denied. So similarly to some of the applications that we use in our day-to-day life, we usually need a username or even a password, username or even email, and the password so that we are able to validate and authenticate the user. So the user must actually provide these two important information, the username or email and the password. So if the user doesn't provide these two information, then they're actually denied access to log into the application. So some of the information that can be provided in some of the applications could be the email and the password, cookies, and even API tokens. So, but now there's another term that we might come across, authorization. So what is authorization? So authorization is just the process of validating privileges to access a resource of the application. So after a user successfully logins to the application, authorization mechanism checks whether the login user has privileges to access the application resources. It actually determines what the user is allowed to do in the application. So authorization in simple terms is the process of validating privileges to access a resource of the application. And this is actually done after the user has been authorized into the application. So after the successful authentication, the system determines if the user has the authority to use or access a specific resource. So taking into consideration of our example, the employee, where we have the employees. So the employee may not have access to everything inside the workplace. So he can enter only those departments which he has authorization. And this is now where authorization comes in. For example, the server room is only accessed by the IT personnel. The finance department can only be accessed by financial related or can be accessed by those who are working in finance. So this is the same case with the application. So when a user is logged in, he is actually authenticated, but he might not have the authority to browse the admin area, access maybe the payroll module, or even access the admin rights. So you only have, you actually need the rights or the privileges to do so. So before determining what the user can do, you must know who actually the user is. And that is why authentication comes first before authorization. So some of these scenario happens. For example, in cases of employee, they may be denied to access maybe the server room, the finance department, the system admin, or the in actually now like application setup, you might now prevent the users from accessing certain modules within the application. For example, the system admin area or even the payroll module, because they have some sensitive information, you only allow the HR officers or even admins to access those modules. So once we have done with this, we need now to know what is the ASP.NET Core membership system. So before the advent of ASP.NET Core identity, .NET used a form authentication system to validate the information. So the system used cookies to store credential information. So when a user logged in into the system, their credentials were verified with the information fetched from the data. So the form authentication system issued a cookie in which the user credentials were embedded. So all these subsequent requests come to the system had to contain that cookie. So if the cookie received was found valid, then only the request will be granted. Otherwise, the users will be redirected to the login page where they will be asked to enter their credentials. So this is when ASP.NET Core identity was not there. But now, what are some of these ASP.NET Core membership? So some of the ASP.NET Core membership. So ASP.NET Core has some types of membership. So we can actually see the evolution of the membership system in ASP.NET Core. So one of it was the form authentication system, which was on ASP.NET 1.0. Another one was the membership provider, which was actually in ASP.NET 2.0. Another one was simple membership, which was actually on ASP.NET 4.0. Then we have the universal membership provider, which was on ASP.NET 4.0, and also you could find it on ASP.NET 4.5. Then we now have what we are meant to discuss today, which is now ASP.NET identity, which is, you will actually find it in ASP.NET 4.5 and above. So we need to discuss now what is this ASP.NET Core identity membership type. So as we had discussed, this is actually a built-in membership, and we need to understand. So ASP.NET Core identity is a fully featured membership system for creating and maintaining user logins. So using Identity API, you can sign in and sign out users, reset their password, lock out users, and implement multi-factor authentication just using ASP.NET Core identity. It can also integrate with external login providers like Microsoft account, Facebook, and Google. So ASP.NET Core identity is an API that supports user interface, that is UI login functionality. You can also manage users, password, profile data, roles, claims, tokens, email confirmation, and even more. So users can create an account with the login information stored in an identity, or they can use an external login provider. So some of the providers that are actually supported include Facebook, Google, Microsoft account, and even Twitter. So when we create a new application, we can actually install the ASP.NET Core identity by choosing the individual accounts under the authentication type option. We'll be able to see this in a very practical way in our next video. So today we are going just to explain what is ASP.NET Core identity. And as we have just said, ASP.NET Core identity is actually a modern membership system that allows you to perform all required membership operations in your web application, such as registration, authentication, and even authorization. So it was designed to replace the previous ASP.NET Core membership that we have just seen. So it can be used in all ASP.NET frameworks like the ASP.NET MVC and even a web API. So we've just understood what is ASP.NET Core identity. So we need to see what are the components of ASP.NET Core identity. So one of the components is actually a user. So one of it is actually the user. So we are going to highlight some of the components of ASP.NET identity. So a user is an entity in the system, so such as a person in an application. So ASP.NET identity as an important class for dealing with personal or person's basic authentication information called the identity user. So the class holds the important information of the user, such as the ID and even the password. So developers actually can create a custom class and derive it from identity user to add more descriptive details about the user. So we are going to see that in our next video on how we can actually do this in real life example. So the next feature is actually, the next component is actually the user manager. So ASP.NET Identity has an important class for managing user accounts called user manager. So the class can be used for managing user accounts and can perform a variety of operations, which is actually creating or removing a user account, modifying passwords, assigning or removing the user from a role. So the next component is actually the role. So ASP.NET Identity provides a basic information about a role. So you can add more description to a specific role. So to do so, programmers can create a custom class and derive it from the class role manager and add actually additional details. So the next thing is the role manager. So we have a class for managing roles called role manager in ASP.NET Core Identity. So the class takes the responsibility of adding, removing, and confirming the existence of a specific role. So the next component is now the authentication manager. So all of the classes we have discussed so far deal with the user and the role, but they do not deal with authentication. So authentication in ASP.NET Identity is handled by the authentication manager class. So this class takes care of signing the user in and out. So the authentication manager interface holds all the necessary information regarding the authentication process. So the next component is actually the entity framework DB context. So the database schema in ASP.NET Identity is created with entity framework code first approach. So the entity framework makes sure that there is a distinct column in the database for each user's information. So by default, all the tables are created in a specific database. So but developers can actually customize the database configuration settings and store the database information in a database. So to do so, we actually create a DB context class that derives from the identity DB context class and store the database information as per our needs. So these are actually some of the components of ASP.NET Core Identity. But now we need to discuss what are some of the features of ASP.NET Core Identity. So we need to know what are the features of ASP.NET Core Identity. And one of the feature is actually a user manager. So we need to understand these components. We have the user management, we have the two-factor authentication, we have the account logout, and you have been able to see the components that actually handle some of these features. We have the role management, decoupling, and external identity providers. So those are some of the features of ASP.NET Core Identity. So the next thing that you need to know is what are some of the new features that has come with identity on .NET 8. So in .NET 8, they have some improvements that they have done on ASP.NET Core Identity. And one is they have actually given us new APIs to simplify login and identity management for client app like single page applications and even the Blazor WebAssembly. So we also have, they have actually enabled token-based authorization and authentication in ASP.NET Core Identity for clients that can't use cookies. They also have some improvements in terms of documentation. So as we have seen, ASP.NET Identity is actually a fully featured membership system for creating and maintaining user accounts. So using Identity API, you can sign in and sign out users, reset their password, log out users, and implement multi-factor authentication. So this is a very good thing that we need to actually adopt. So the next thing that I want us to discuss is what are some of the identity classes. So ASP.NET Core Identity has some classes, and one is the managers, the stores, the entities. So we are going to see some of the entities in our today's video and what are their roles in when it comes to ASP.NET Core identity. So one, we need to see some of these identity or models or entities. So just to indicate some of these models, one is the identity role. You also have the identity role claim. So identity role, the work of the identity role in ASP.NET Core, it is actually, it gives us a table called ASP.NET roles. So Microsoft.NET Core Identity namespace contains the entity models of the identity API. So these are some of the entity models for the identity API. So one is the identity role. The second one is actually identity role claim. We have the identity user. We have the identity user claim, the identity user login. We have the identity user role. We have the identity user token. But now I want us to see what is the identity user. So this one, we have the ASP.NET identity user, and we have the ASP.NET users table. So this is actually gives us the primary table to store user information. Identity user claim, you'll be able to see when we will be creating our application. There is a table called ASP.NET user claims, which actually is a table that holds the claims associated with the user. We also have the identity user login, which actually translates to ASP.NET user logins, is a table holds the information about third party or external logins. We have the identity user token, which translates to ASP.NET user tokens table, is actually for storing tokens received from the external login providers. We have the identity user role, which is actually translated to ASP.NET user roles table, and it actually gives us the table information that contains the roles assigned to the user. We have the identity roles, which translates to ASP.NET roles table that stores the roles. Then, as we had said, we have the identity role claim, which translates to ASP.NET roles claims, and this table holds the claims that are assigned to the user. So users, actually, the ASP.NET Core users table holds the registered users of our applications. The user claims is actually a set of claims. Actually, this is a name value pairs. We'll be able to discuss this that represent the user's identity. So we are going to see so we have actually seen the identity models and the entities, which are the identity role claim. And if you are keen, you'll be able to see that some of these identity, we have their respective tables, and we have actually defined some of these tables that they store the users, the user claims, the user tokens, and others, as we have actually seen. Then we have the identity stores. So we have the user store and we have the role store. So in ASP.NET identity, there are two types of stores. We have the user store and the role store. So the user store class implements the user store, which actually contains some of the methods like the create a user, delete a user, find a user by an ID, update a user, and even get a user password, check if a user has a password, and set a user password. So it has the high user role store and even high user password store interfaces. But there are a lot of interfaces that we are not going to touch today. So another one, so on the roles store, so the role store class implements some of the interfaces like the iRole store. So which has some methods like create a role, update a role, delete a role, find a role by an ID, and even find a role by name. So there are a lot of interfaces that we'll be able to discuss in our next video. But today we want us to see some of the, so we also have some identity services or even managers like the role manager, the user manager, and sign-in manager. So these are very important services that we have on ASP.NET Core Identity. So the sign-in manager, the role manager, and the user manager. So there are two important identity services in ASP.NET Core Identity, which are the user manager and sign-in manager. So we also have the role manager. So the user manager performs the user-related operations by calling the user store. The role manager performs the role-related operations by calling the role store. The sign-in manager performs sign-in operations for the users. So we have a lot of classes that are actually used to do this. But today we are just mentioning and clarifying some of these details. So how to work with roles in ASP.NET Core Identity? We can actually create roles that contain a set of permissions for performing a set of activities in the application. So we'll be able to see these as we go along. But for the user manager, we've said that the user manager actually performs a user-related operations by calling the user store. The role manager performs the role-related operations by calling the role store, and the sign-in manager performs the sign-in operations for the user. So we now understand some of the identity services, which are the role manager, the user manager, and the sign-in manager. And mostly they do operations related to users, the roles, and even to applications. Some of it are actually crude. So on our next thing that we need to understand, we have actually seen the sign-in manager. As we've seen, it is actually is a concrete class which handles the user sign-in information from the application. So the sign-in manager is actually responsible for authenticating a user, like signing in and even signing out a user. It issues the authentication cookie to the user. So this is very important when it comes to ASP.NET Core Identity. But now there are some of the various things that we need to understand before we actually wrap up our presentation today. One is the claims, claim identity, and even the claim principle. So when we talk about ASP.NET Core Identity, if you don't understand claims, claim identity, and even claim principle, some of these things doesn't make sense. So ASP.NET Core uses claim-based authentication, and we are going to discuss today some of these three important items: the claim, claim identity, and even the claim principle. So I want us to be very keen on this video so that you're able to understand what is a claim. So this is where now everything makes sense when it comes to ASP.NET Core Identity. So ASP.NET Core Identity claims are name value pair issued to users to represent what the users are allowed to do. So for example, a person driving license is issued by a driving license authority. A driving license authority gives a person a license, but in this license, we can actually get the date of birth in the driving license. We can also get the name. So what is the claim in this sense? So the claim is actually the date of birth. The claim can be the first name. So as we have just said, a claim are actually a name value pair issued to users to represent what the users are allowed to do. So in ASP.NET Core Identity, we actually need to understand a claim so that this makes sense. One, we've said a claim is a name value pair that represent what the subject is, not what the subject can do. It is actually a piece of information about the user, not what the user can or cannot do. So claims are user data and they are issued by trusted sources. They are different from roles. For example, an email is the name, then the value is the macro code at gmail.com. Username is the admin, age is 20, and gender is male. So gender is actually the name, the value is male. Age is actually the name, then the value is 20. We've said a claim is a name value pair that represent what the subject is. So you'll be able to see that a claim can be a first name, username, phone number, age, email address, and even the height. So this actually gives us the information about the user. So the claims-based authorization works by checking if the user has a claim to access a URL. So in ASP.NET Core, we create policies to implement the claims-based authorization. So the policy defines what the user must process to satisfy the policy. So when we apply the policy on the controller actions, so we actually apply these on the controller's action methods or even razor pages. So only those users who carry claims which satisfies the policies are allowed to access those resources. So we've actually made this simplified, and we have just said that claims are the simplest entity that is used for identity. They simply are a wrapper for a key and a value according to an issuer. So which all of them are strings. So we've said it is actually a key and a value according to an issuer. You can say it is actually a name value pair. So this is actually what is a claim. But now let's make sense. What is a claim identity? So when you see ASP.NET Core identity and you see something called claim identity, what is it? So a claim identity is actually a collection of claims. So a claim identity is actually a collection of claims. So to understand this, a person can have a driving license, a person can have a credit card, a person can have a passport, and a person can have a Google account. So all these are actually claims identities. So all these claims identities, we can get some of the key information within the credit card, the driving license, the passport, and even the Google account. So from these claim identities, we are able to get the first name of the person, we can get the name, the username, we can get the phone number, we can get the age, we can get the email address, and we can even get the height. And we've just said all of these are actually claims. So the claim identity class is a concrete implementation of a claims-based identity. So that is an identity described by a collection of claims. So in ASP.NET Core identity, the claims identity class represents a user in our application. So it actually describes who they are and helps manage the list of claims which they actually have. So claims identity helps us in creating the identity. So if you grasp what claims represent, the rest of the information will be easier. So we've just said claims are actually name value pair, which actually represent a user. Then claim identity is now a collection of claims. So claim identity, a passport can have the credit cards, which has some claims. A person can have driving license, which have some claims, and even a person can have a passport, which has some claims, and even a Google account. So the claim identity type is only a wrapper for a bunch of claims, which makes sense. So the identity of a person is based on several statements about him. For example, if we take an example of someone called macrocode, a macrocode person or even an individual has a name. A macrocode person is actually a citizen of a certain country, and maybe they have an height. So that is how you identify that kind of a person. But maybe let's move forward so that we now make sense. So this brings us to another thing. What is a claim principle? So since we have our identity, we can now create or even understand what is a claim principle. So what we have gone so far is we have actually defined our claim identity, and we have actually defined claims. But now, what is a claim principle? So a claim principle contains a collection of claim identity. So we have seen that a claim principle is actually kind of a user. One, we've said a claim identity is a collection of claims. And a claim identity can be a credit card, can be driving license, passport, and even Google. And we've said these credit card, driving license, passport, and Google account has some claims in it. So it is actually a collection of claims. So this claim identity now makes the claim identities. So all these credit card, driving license, passport, and Google account in general are called claim identities. But now all these, we can get some information within it. First name, username, passport, age, email address, and height. So, and you've said all these are claims. So the claim identity, the collection of credit card, driving license, passport, or Google account actually makes the claims principal. And we've said now, this information, the credit card, driving license, passport, and Google account, can define a certain user. So that means all this information makes a claim principal. That means a claim principal is a collection of claim identity. A person can have a passport, a Google account, driving license, and credit card. All this information can define a certain user. So that means claim principal is a collection of claim identity. So in short terms, we can say claim principal is actually a user. So, but now, does this make sense? Let's see how this is implemented. So how does claim-based authorization works? So in ASP.NET Core, we have various ways on how this is actually implemented. One, claim-based authorization works by checking if the user has a claim to access an URL. The second way on how it works, in ASP.NET Core, we create policies to implement claim-based authorization. This means claims are actually policy-based. So the third item is the policy defines what claims that a user must process to satisfy the policy. The fourth item is only those users who carry claims which satisfy the policy is allowed to access the resources or even are redirected to access denied page. But we have just gone through all this information. Do we have an analogy to actually give us a sense on how this is done? So let's define or even have an analogy to explain claim-based authentication. So one, assuming we have a user called Job, then a user applies for a driving license. So the driving license in this case is our identity. So the driving license is our identity because it has some information about this user. And is actually a document that can be used to validate or even identify this user called Job. But this user called Job is actually a student. So when applying for a driving license, they need to pay some fee. But now they want a discount to be given to them because they're actually students. So they now request for a discount. But now for them to be identified as student, they need to present a student card. So another identity is now required so that they are actually taken as students or they are identified as a student. So they need to begin to present a student card to show that they're actually maybe in a university somewhere and they are studying a certain course and they are in which particular year of study. So this user called Job is actually a claim principal, is actually a user. And this user, in his driving license, we can get some claims. We can get the name, the date of birth, the address, the ID number, and even the license number. But now on our student card, we can also get some claims. We can get the name of Job, we can get the date of birth of Job, we can get the university they are studying, the ID number, the email address, the student number according to the university, and even the department in which they are in. So Job is our claim principal. So Job has some claim identities. And these claim identities is, one, you can use driving license to identify Job. You can also use a student card to identify Job. And you can see some of the information from this claim identity is now a collection of all our claims from different identities that Job has. One, we have the name, the date of birth, the university, the ID number, the email, student number, department, address, and even the license. So some of this information, we can now get them from the claim identities. And we've said these are the name, the date of birth are actually claimed. So all of this information, so if you check, our driving license is now our claim identity. And when we talk about authentication type, we'll actually use that driving license to actually validate Job when we are dealing with something else or even dealing with the applications. So within our driving license, we can get the information about Job. One is the name, the date of birth, the address, ID number, and even the license number. But now our second identity about Job that Job has is actually the student card. So the authentication type here that we'll use is the student card, and he has some information which is actually claims the name, the date of birth, the university ID number, email address, student, and even the department. So this gives us a complete analogy of how to see what we have actually discussed. So I hope you guys like the video. Subscribe to our channel, comment down below, and even I will see you in our next video. Bye.